Hi, everyone. I think I forgot to connect my AirPods. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. All right. Sorry about that. Although, this is actually really appropriate for our topic. And I was even thinking as I was about to record this, um, we're going to be talking about perfectionism and eating disorders today. And ironically, I had recorded this webinar yesterday and decided that there were too many mistakes and it didn't flow well and all that I was going to re-record it. And it just now occurred to me that I did that with the topic on perfectionism. So what can I say? Takes one to know one, I guess. I don't know. But I'm really excited that you guys are here. This is a topic that comes up frequently in working with eating disorders. And for that matter, even more than eating disorders, this is something that I see come up a lot just in general with a lot of the clients that I work with. And so I just gonna kind of provide some initial information for you guys. We're just kind of dipping our toe in the water in some of this stuff and hopefully either learn something new or just confirm what you already know, what you're already working on with clients or in your own treatment or just in general. So before we get started, as always, just a reminder, this is just meant to be kind of supplemental educational information. By no means is this webinar intended to be therapy or supervision or anything like that, okay? All right, so let's get started. I will share my screen. We'll get to our PowerPoint. Okay, cool. And we will play. Excellent. Okay, cool. All right, perfectionism and eating disorders. So hopefully you guys like what I did there. You might do a little bit of exposures today, right? With kind of letting some things go. So this is such an important topic because I think this is often one of those underlying issues that comes up in eating disorders, and yet it still presents with eating disorder behaviors like I'll be talking about. But much of the time, this is something that occurs in someone before they even get an eating disorder and can certainly occur even once someone is much better with behaviors, like more recovery behaviors. They might still struggle with a lot of perfectionism. It may just present differently. And so this is why I like to address this with a lot of my clients. So let's jump in. So I hear this a lot, something to this effect, but I'm not a perfectionist. I made a B+ once. Do you guys ever hear that? Or have you ever said something like that yourself, maybe? It's so funny, right? And of course, you guys know me. I love to just kind of have a sense of humor and just joke about some things, and we can laugh together with all of this, right? But the thing is that a lot of times individuals are surprised to hear that some of what they're going through is a perfectionistic kind of thing. Perfectionism comes up in different forms. So there's this one article which I'll talk about that lists at least 5 different types of perfectionism. And what I would say is that chances are within these 5 different types, someone with an eating disorder falls into at least one category. So Dr. Jeff Szymanski is the one who wrote this article. This was several years ago. It was called Perfectionism, Are You Sure It Pays Off? It was in the International OCD Foundation journal, I believe. And he said this, he said, perfectionism can be thought of as a phobia of mistake making. So I thought that was interesting. And like we're going to talk about, it comes in different forms. Well, one form might be what's called rigid rule following. And this is an individual who's probably very detail oriented. They perhaps live by the mantra, do it right or don't do it at all. And it's possible that others maybe describe them as being controlling. So one example might be a student who, in order to study and prepare for an upcoming quiz, they will meticulously highlight in their textbook, they make a ton of note cards, and maybe they create 3 different practice tests for this upcoming quiz. And all of that in order to get an A+, okay? And let's also throw in there that this person is someone who already has a average of 100 in the class, 100%. And let's say during the course of the semester, they get to throw out 3 quiz grades. Okay. So this is someone who's, kind of like, they don't need a good grade on this quiz. They could even just get a 0 on it and it had nothing to do with their GPA or whatever, and they say, no, this is a quiz. I'm going to study for it the way that I do everything else. This is the right thing to do. Do it right or don't do it at all, right? So what does this look like in eating disorders? This could look like many different things, but I kind of thought one like rigid rule that sometimes people have is maybe only eating foods with ingredients they can pronounce. I see this a lot in a type of eating disorder that's not really an exact diagnosis, but we refer to it as orthorexia. It's basically kind of like pathological clean eating, meaning that someone is so obsessed with healthy foods or that kind of thing that it really interferes with their life in other ways. So this might be a really rigid rule that they have. And I don't know. I think that if they're missing out, if they have things with what's that one sauce that gets put in a bunch of different things? It's so good. It's like Worcestershire, or I never know how to pronounce it. Or there's this really great like spice thing. I don't know if it's local to Texas or not, but it's like Tony Chachere's. My husband always laughs when I try to pronounce it. Tony Sacheries or something. Anyway, I mean, they're missing out on some of these cool things, right? So could also be an individual who maybe brings their own salad dressing to a restaurant just in case that restaurant doesn't have the right one. So maybe the rule is something like, I can only have this brand of fat-free, blah, 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 blah dressing, so it's a rule. So they're just going to bring it with them to the restaurant, something like that. Now, caveat, this is all apart from legitimate food allergies. Okay. So someone who maybe has, anaphylactic shock with peanuts and they have a rigid rule of not eating anything with peanuts, by all means, please don't eat the peanuts. Okay. Here's another form of perfectionism. This is an individual where everything is a high priority. So this is an individual who wants to do everything well. They have a hard time discerning what tasks are more important than others. So that's the thing in many ways, right? There's nothing wrong with wanting to do well in things. There's might be a little problem wanting to do well in everything. And then a bigger problem if everything is of equal importance to you, right? So this might be a student who is putting the same amount of time, effort, and energy into washing and cleaning their car as they do studying for their final exams, right? Or maybe it's someone who has a really big presentation at work the next day, but they are washing and cleaning their car the night before, right? Because it rained this week. And in Houston, my gosh, it's hard to know when to even clean your car because the rain is just it's so unpredictable and just comes. And what is that thing, you clean your car, guaranteed it's gonna rain the next day, or you're gonna drive through a sprinkler or something like that, right? So, it's kind of thinking it's hard to prioritize because it's like, well, I have a dirty car and I have a presentation tomorrow. So I got to figure out a way to do both, but they're kind of, missing the priority there. Because typically, right, you would think if you had a big presentation the next day or a big final exam or studying for the MCAT or something, that the night before you would really be preparing for that in different ways. Now, that being said, there might be some, kind of caveats to this as well, maybe some exceptions, but this is just kind of one I thought of. In eating disorders, what everything is a high priority may look like is when an individual prioritizes whatever is in front of them instead of eating a snack when it is needed. So a lot of times in eating disorder recovery, especially in the beginning, our clients are on kind of a maybe what I would call a feeding regimen, as we're trying to regulate hunger and fullness cues, as we're trying to get the body nourished and all that. And so typically early on in recovery, it's going to be kind of set times or time frames probably where you're eating breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack. Okay. Usually something to that effect. Sometimes there might just be 2 snacks in there, but it just depends. And it's not till later on in recovery that we get to a lot more flexibility with that. Okay. But one of the things I hear a lot is like, oh, I wasn't able to get in my snack. Yeah, my boss came into my office and stayed there for 30 minutes and just was talking to me about something really important. And so the time went by and I couldn't eat a snack. So that's why I didn't eat the snack that day. Or I have a lot of clients who are educators, and they maybe have, gosh, a 3-minute transition time in between classes or something like that, or a very short lunch break, and they've got to do some grading or calling back a parent or something like that. And so there might be other things that really get in the way of that snack. Now, if you don't have an eating disorder and you're one who can make up the snack later on, or maybe you're eating intuitively and you happen to not be hungry for that snack, that's not a problem. But in eating disorder recovery, the idea being that sometimes it's hard for individuals to really prioritize a big behavioral component of their recovery, which is eating at regular intervals. Another example might be when someone turns down social invitations in order to get in some exercise. So it might be that they're used to, here's the workout I do every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I do it at this time of morning and I do this type of exercise and it lasts this long. And maybe they get an invitation with some girlfriends to meet up for coffee on Wednesday morning. But because it feels like, well, I really want to do that, but I always do exercise, or I don't know how to fit in both. So gosh, so they'll choose exercise a lot of times, but it will come at a lot of distress because they also wanted to go to coffee, and just weren't sure how to prioritize that and maybe skip a day of exercise, or maybe exercise at a different point during the day or something like that, right? So a lot of times everything can feel like a high priority in eating disorders. Mistakes are unbearable and must be avoided at all costs. Oh, I see another little typo. I capitalized both letters in at. Hey, this is great. This is some good exposures. I had a feeling we'd have some of this. And that picture is a little high on the slide. Anyway, okay, good. This is great. See, no big deal. I'm okay. I'm not going to redo this. So we're good. Right. So mistakes are unbearable and must be avoided at all costs. So this is where this might be a perfectionist who really truly does have that phobia of mistake making. And so there's someone who maybe will try and hide real or perceived mistakes. It also can be tough to give this type of perfectionist any kind of constructive feedback because it might be perceived as not respecting or liking the person. This individual may also engage in a gross overestimation of consequences for mistakes. Okay. So they're thinking like, something minor and like, oh my gosh, if my partner knew about that, if my boss knew about that, they'd kill me, And so maybe they try and hide it or delay telling that person something like that. So yeah, one example might be an individual who doesn't disclose to an employer a miscalculation that they made, say on a spreadsheet or something. Or maybe even they blame a coworker for it, or maybe it's just very passive. Maybe like they let the coworker take the fall and they just never kind of speak up, And again, this in this kind of situation has nothing to do with malicious intent for that coworker or something like that, or that they want the business to suffer or whatever. It's just that, again, think of that phobia of mistake making. Oh, it is so difficult to kind of own up to that. So in eating disorders, mistakes as unbearable may look like someone who is hiding wrappers and other evidence of eating foods that maybe they claim they don't eat, or perhaps they have binged on, okay, something like that. Another example might be the belief of they will gain a lot of weight for eating a fear food. So again, that overestimation of negative consequences, thinking if I eat this, oh my gosh, I'm going to blow up, I'm going to gain 10 pounds, So something like that, that maybe is how it could come up with eating disorders. Another type of perfectionist is someone who engages in excessive repetition until it feels just right. And this might be an individual who also kind of shares maybe some qualities of obsessive compulsive kind of concerns, right? That just right kind of feeling. So this is someone who may over edit their projects or papers or something like that. The hard part with this is when you think about growing up, being in high school and college, and maybe even as adults in the workforce, oh man, they are often very much praised for this kind of behavior. Maybe their paper or their project is put on a pedestal as the best one in the class or something like that. So unfortunately, that kind of thing can really reinforce this behavior. And it might be, another example might be an artist who is not allowing anyone to see a work in progress, or someone who's a writer who won't let anyone see a rough draft of their work. Okay. So they will continue doing things over and over and over until it feels just right. Although I will say, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but rarely does this individual ever get to the point where it feels just right. It's kind of that sense of it's never actually good enough. So in eating disorders, one example I kind of thought of is an individual who won't wear certain items of clothing or go to certain types of parties or whatever until he or she fits into a certain size or has a certain aesthetic. So, this might be someone who, getting ready for the summer or like a holiday party or something like that, they are engaging in excessive repetition of eating disorder behaviors until they lose X amount of weight or until they fit in this dress or something like that, And often, again, when that doesn't happen, they just won't go at all. So that might be one example with an eating disorder. There's many other types of examples. I was trying to just think of something off the top of my head when I did this, but there are others for sure. Procrastination. This is the fifth one, and fifth and final one from this particular article. And this is often the perfectionist who does not identify as such. This is the person who says, oh no, you should see my room. I have like the messiest room ever, But part of it is that ultimately they are waiting until they have enough energy to clean or organize in an ideal way. So they may have a messy desk, a messy room, that kind of thing. But again, it goes back to they have unrealistic expectations. And so because they know this and they don't have the energy to like clean up a room spick and span, then they just don't do it at all. Or they just wait for that time. This may also be an individual who does not even turn in a paper or a project on time because it's simply not good enough. So kind of has a little bit of overlap with the excessive repetition, right? That also might come in the form of procrastination. With eating disorders, I see this a lot in the sense that it could be someone even putting off recovery. They're kind of procrastinating recovery, whether it's treatment or meal planning or self-care, because they just don't feel like they have the motivation or energy needed to put in all that work. So let's say it's someone with binge eating disorder, and part of the treatment regimen is helping them be prepared with food and that kind of thing. And so, part of that being that, okay, well, they got to, think about what are some of the meals they might want that week that sounds good. And then they got to make a grocery list and then go to the grocery store and get those ingredients and then set aside time to make those meals, Well, you think about that and yeah, does that take a little extra time? Absolutely. If you're a perfectionist, you might be, spending an inordinate amount of time doing each of those things and just stressing over it and all of that, to where maybe you just don't even get to it because you just, again, how much energy that takes and you don't feel like you have it. So as a result, you haven't done any prepping for the week. And so it's so much easier to go back into those binge behaviors without kind of like an established regimen of eating regularly and prepping your meals and that kind of thing. Another example that I see is in the form of what we call the Last Supper, which is the meal that typically occurs right before starting a diet or rigid meal plan. Or, interestingly enough, this often happens right before someone goes into treatment. So not starting a diet, but knowing that they won't necessarily have the opportunities for binge eating or something like that before they go into treatment, binging and purging or whatever. So they'll make sure they do it the night before. So again, procrastinating those recovery behaviors that ultimately they know they want, but they know how much time, effort, and energy can go into recovery. So those are just a few examples there. One of the things that I work on with clients, because I try not to just stop there, right, with kind of describing all these things, but is understanding what's underneath all of that. So, right, some of these behaviors are just tip of the iceberg. We have to look at what's underneath all that. I find that fear is often the driving factor behind each of these forms of perfectionism. Could be fear, could be fear of rejection, fear of losing respect or disappointing people, or just the fear of not living up to perceived or real expectations. So what do we do about all of this? The cool thing is, and this is one reason I love being a therapist, is because there's always hope, right? There's always hope to get better. There's always hope to improve quality of life, whatever that means for each of us, you know? And one thing, I'm a very integrative therapist. There are a lot of different types of therapists who are really big on one particular approach, and they are hugely experts in that one particular approach, and they use it to treat all sorts of clients. And I think that that can work for some people. I'm different though. I'm more integrated. I feel that, you know, each client walking through my door is not cookie cutter. So they're individuals, and it's better for me and my clients if I am well versed in a variety of therapies, because I'm not a believer in a one size fits all approach. So you know, some of these I'm more trained in than others, which I will disclose. But I'm just a really big believer that it's helpful for clients to know that, look, if we try this and it doesn't work, we got this to try, you know? And so there's all these different things that can be helpful, and everyone's different to know what works for them. So that's just me. That's just my opinion. Cognitive behavioral, really a great treatment for all of this. And it essentially addresses how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all play a role in working on perfectionism. And so it certainly addresses the behaviors, whether it's procrastination or the excessive repetition, something like that. It will address all that behaviors, but it will do that through looking at the thoughts and the emotions that come with that. So understanding the emotions of the fear or something else that's there, maybe the thought of, you know, if I don't do this, then I will be a failure, and kind of looking at, gosh, where did that thought come from? How intense is that thought? How frequently do you have that thought? What's the evidence for and against that thought? Walk me through that, you know, and then maybe doing some restructuring of that. Okay. So CBT is great. ACT, so I know CBT a lot more than I know ACT. So I just want to, you know, give ACT a little bit of recognition here, but I want you guys to know I'm not an expert in ACT. ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And ultimately, it's really about the acceptance of thoughts and feelings and committed action to our values. And so ACT really kind of says, look, don't worry about the thoughts and feelings. We all have uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. They are just there. They come and go. It's kind of whatever. Don't even work on those things. And so certain skills in ACT might work on diffusion of those thoughts. It might even just be saying, I'm having the thought that I'm a failure if I don't do this right. Okay. And just acknowledging, okay, that's a thought you have, you know. But it goes a lot deeper into what are the person's values in relationship, value in career, value in community, so many different things. And then kind of looking at, okay, well, what actions then are consistent with that value? So maybe the action is, I'm going to turn in my paper anyway, even though it doesn't feel quite right to me. I'm going to turn it in because that is more consistent with the values that I have for education and career. Okay, so it's a good one. DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy. And this is standard DBT. I didn't put anything in here on radically open DBT, which I am intensively trained in. DBT, I'm not, but I just kind of put it in here because I do think they have some really important skills for all of this. So this is standard dialectical behavior therapy that talks a lot about various skills in 4 different categories: emotion regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal effectiveness. And so some of these different skills might address, of course, the emotion regulation with the fear that comes up, skills for handling distress tolerance. So as we engage in less perfectionistic behaviors, we might have increased fear or distress or something. So skills to deal with that. Might be mindfulness-based skills related to learning how to be present in the moment and focusing on that so that we're not catastrophizing about the future perceived negative consequences, that kind of thing. Could also be interpersonal effectiveness. You know, it might be learning how to tell your boss you made a mistake instead of hiding it, being able to say, you know, hey, I wanted to be upfront with you. This is really hard for me, and I wanted you to know I made a mistake on this spreadsheet, and I need some help fixing it, or here's how I plan to fix it, or this coworker fixed it for me or with me or something like that, right? But having those skills for interpersonal effectiveness. Exposure with response prevention, or ERP. This is a great one for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So I use a lot of it for clients who are engaging in OCD, or if their eating disorder kind of looks OCD, even if it isn't clinically diagnosable. But this is basically learning how to gradually habituate to the anxiety of the feared stimuli, and also gaining an understanding that perceived consequences rarely occur. And so this is, again, gradual being a key word. You gradually expose that person to the thing that they fear. Maybe it's learning how to make mistakes even on purpose, just to get used to understanding that your feared consequence isn't really going to happen. So maybe it's someone who has a fear of, tripping in front of people because they'll look really, really stupid, So an exposure might be helping that person to intentionally trip a little bit. We're not trying to go for injuries, but trip in front of people and just notice what happens, and typically, you don't have to be embarrassed at all, or not that much, maybe you could laugh out loud and say, oh gosh, just call me Grace, or something like that, or noticing that, well, people are just likely to help you and just help you up and ask if you're okay, and tell them, oh, I did the same thing last week, that kind of thing. And so ERP, we gradually get to those points of exposures with clients. Anti-perfectionism is really it goes under cognitive behavioral therapy, but I put it separate because this book from Dr. David Burns called Feeling Good is amazing. It's really a book on depression, but he has a whole chapter in there on perfectionism. And so I use a lot of the approaches that he uses in there. But basically, anti-perfectionism is a strategy involving striving to do less than you did the day before. And if you do anything above that, it's just icing on the cake. All right. So you guys see what I did there? I'm just trying to throw in food references. I work with eating disorders. That's what I do. What can I say? It's an exposure. Okay. All right. So, right. And he gives the example of, he wanted to become a runner, or he was preparing for some kind of race, but he wasn't a runner at all. So knowing that he kind of maybe veers toward perfectionism, because a lot of times perfectionists will say, okay, if I do this on day one, I got to do more on day two and even more on day three, right? And that you get burnout, it's unrealistic. And for certain things, your body cannot tolerate that, So knowing this about himself, he said, okay, my goal with running is to do less than I did the day before. And through that, he was able to run further and faster than day one within a short period of time, like a few months, And it was great because on days when he woke up just not feeling it, or he had a cold or something like that, not running at all, or maybe just a tiny bit less than the day before, right? He had already met his goal, and that felt really good. So there wasn't a lot of this, fear of failure that really comes up. It was kind of like, okay, I met my goal. And then other days, running less than the day before, maybe he ran a mile the day before, so he goes, 0.9 miles or something like that, and he's like, oh, this feels really good, this weather is amazing, and my knees are feeling really good, I got a great outfit on, I'm gonna keep going. And maybe he does 3 miles that day, so that's more than his goal. But again, that's okay, because just because you have a goal doesn't mean you can't go above and beyond it. And I really love what he says, because he talks about, a lot of times perfectionists really struggle with this idea, and for them, it maybe feels like you're just telling them to be mediocre at whatever they're doing. But the reality is that he says is a lot of times perfectionists have no idea how much doing what they do holds them back, and how they could be even more successful. So it's a really great book. I highly recommend it, especially those chapters. So as we kind of close, one thing I really want to remind everybody is that we are perfectionists because we care. We have this fear in us, or anxiety, or whatever it is, because we care about doing a good job. So when I work with clients, I'm really talking about, look, we are not trying to take this away from you at all. We are trying to make this work for you, not work against you. So perfectionism can really be used for the good in eating disorder recovery. So these are some things I talk about with clients. Following treatment recommendations. Look, this is really hard stuff, but being someone who probably has a lot of self-discipline and a lot of maybe even distressed over tolerance in them, that kind of thing, they can use that for the good. Carolyn Costin, who's really well known in treating eating disorders, and she had an eating disorder herself when she was a teenager, but she talks about if you really want to see someone, for example, with anorexia nervosa, exert some willpower, put a chocolate chip cookie in front of them and see if they will eat it. And she kind of talks about it doesn't take willpower for someone with anorexia to not eat a chocolate chip cookie. That's easy. The willpower is, are they willing to eat it? Are they willing to build in some flexibility in their relationship with food? So I love that idea. Learning to prioritize our values. So for those of us who struggle that everything seems equally important in treatment, we can kind of decide, well, these values are really important to me, a little bit more so than these values. So put 90% of your effort into these values and maybe less effort in these values, right? Recognizing success in even the small things. A lot of perfectionists really struggle, right, with all of these unrealistic expectations that once they do really well in something and maybe get a lot of external accolades for that, it still just doesn't feel good enough, or they're already on to the next goal. So learning how to recognize success in even the small things, finding growth opportunities and constructive feedback. So still wanting to do a really good job and being very good, excellent at what we do, but open enough that we can hear constructive feedback. So those are just some ideas. Well, thanks you guys so much for hanging in there. I hope that there's been a couple of things that stuck out to you, or like I said earlier, that this is just kind of confirmation for what you already know. That's okay too. So let me just stop sharing, and then I want to get back to you guys. Okay, here we go. Cool. Yeah, so I love talking about this. It just comes up in different forms, and not just with eating disorders, but a lot of different things. And so I hope you guys found it helpful. Again, I'm Meredith Riddick. You have my information. If you have any questions or need anything, you can email me directly, meredith@harmonytherapygroup.com. Thanks so much. Bye.